Okay. When the sun noticed its shadows. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode. In today's episode, I'll be speaking on behalf of the sun. So it begins, alright. Through certain experiences and then observations of human nature and my own human nature, a sentence arose which I initially wanted to name the episode. Where is it? I wanted to name the episode initially, is corruption a compromise for incompetence? But then I wanted to go a bit more in depth and use myself as a sort of example, right, about when a human being notices not their, let's say their shadows, or their shadow, aspects of their shadow self, but pretty much this notion of this idea of corruption, cruelty, and indecency. These are ideas that in some sense the species needs to look at many times before we cultivate some sort of efficiency beyond them. And for those people who expect to notepad this episode, it's like the battery died, guys, and I can't find the charger. It's like but anyways, so before I dive into my own analysis of what my eyes provide me, I will read for the viewers some things about the psychology of corruption. And in some sense it is a consideration of micro-level explanations for unethical behavior. So it's pretty much in point form. I'll read it for the viewers. And okay, let me first read the definition of corruption. I've realized that if one has an ability to notice or discriminate that their emotions are, even though they arise from what happens in the moment, but the actuality of the moment is in some sense some sort of design of occurrence irrelevant to a person's emotion. So I thought of looking into ideas that I haven't covered before, pretty much. I want to talk about something that I don't often talk about in this episode. So, first thing, definition of corruption. Let's say you're someone who doesn't know what corruption is, and somebody's like, man, go ask the dictionary. The first definition of corruption: dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery. The action of making someone or something morally depraved, or the state of being so. The process by which something, typically a word or expression, is changed from its original use or meaning to one that is regarded as erroneous or debased. The process of causing errors to appear in a computer program or database, and an archaic term for it is decay, putrefaction. The potato turned black and rotten with corruption. See, guys, even potatoes can be corrupt. Like, corruption's everywhere. And the viewers can let me know if the audio is too loud in the background. When I checked it, it sounded decent. So, towards the psychology, the cognitive psychology, and micro-level explanations of unethical behavior. These are the points, right? Individuals holding power are more likely to act corruptly. Individuals are more likely to act corruptly when they stand to gain personally, have lower self-control, perceive that corruption will only cause indirect harm, and when they work in organizations where unethical behavior is not punished, right? Okay, let me go through these one by one. So the first point, okay, let me read them all and then I'll return to all of them. The third point is individuals are likely to be more risk acceptant to offset losses and risk averse to preserve gains. Uncertainty is likely to increase the likelihood of acting corruptly. And at some point about this, I mean, think of it this way. If one is in a corrupt environment, right, their uncertainty means they don't have preference, so the environment indirectly gives them a preference. In the next thing, it says rationalization narratives seem to make corruption more acceptable. That means something that is devoid of emotion, right? If a person's emotionless, like it's easy for them to be corrupt because the corrupt is just an action, right? If a person doesn't care, like you see everything to some degree has a sort of consequence. There's a cause and effect modality to it. But the emotion for the aftermath of something, if that's not there, if a human being doesn't care for what happens, corruption is like a robot just destroying everything can be a corrupt, the same way a politician, let's say, being corrupt, destroying everything. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's devoid of a dimension where decency is required to consider that human beings are actually emotional entities. Can consider, I'll read the rest of the points, but I'll say this, that we can consider that the human mind is literally a potential to move and access various kinds of realities. Technically, the potential of, let's say, kindness and cruelty, I don't know, corruption and justice, like their potentials are there. It is just pretty much how an object through a subjective acceptance animates, right, and the consequences of their physical animation. All right, next point. To mitigate these cognitive influences, practitioners should support measures that improve information flows about the costs of corruption, that reward ethical behavior and set basic integrity standards, and that improve organizational decision making. Then the final point is just more like, okay, it says more research is required on how, which, and when particular cognitive psychological mechanisms make corruption more or less likely, the social psychology of corruption, and how social and cognitive psychologies interplay, the psychological effects of corruption on individuals, as well as case studies of political elites. Yeah, I mean, see, it's pretty much the human being is this. All right, so now I'll just go into it. I would say the way I'm approaching it is that I'm looking at the human being, and this was a discovery for me. What for others, maybe, I don't know, maybe they knew it, maybe they still don't know it. But for me, I realized that the human being is not living just one lifetime, jolly lifetime. The human being is actually constituted of an inner life and an outer life. In most cases, our inner life, which is a metaphor for our mind, right? It's like the mind requires to move faster than the body, and then the body follows, right? To me, I use the metaphor, and I'm a person who I acknowledge the presence of the unknown in this world. So the concept of a soul is just another way of telling me like an unknown presence of intelligence. So for me, I see the soul in some sense as the general that is not in the battlefield, and I see the mind Okay, sorry about that. To continue, I pretty much see the idea of the soul as a general that is not in the battlefield. I see the mind as a commanding officer that is there, closer to the front lines, and I see the body as the metaphor of the soldiers. Right now, when we look at the human intelligence, pretty much the body is being orchestrated. Its movements arise due to the mind. What is the mind? For most people, their consideration of a mind is pretty much this biochemical mechanism that in some sense records versions of itself, and pretty much it's like a combination of memory plus what the body is plus how the moment happens, and that they can incorporate like elements where some people consider as epigenetical. It's pretty much what is influencing you from outside of you and what is influencing you from within you. Okay. So we have an inner life and we have an outer life. And the idea of the last point was pretty much how much of our behaviors how much of our behavior is because of what is happening outside of us and what is happening inside of us. Now, I don't have the notepad here, but I would classify this as, pretty much in the outer realms, I see 3 dimensions, and in the inner realms, I technically, on some level, don't see dimensions, and on another level, I see sort of duality at work. In the outer realms, we find the classifications of a self, we find the classification of the species, and we find the classification of the world. Pretty much 3 dimensions that are important to be acknowledged. So this idea of the sun noticing its shadow and following upon this Jungian view that every person has a relationship with the unconscious mind of their moment. And so there are certain things, it's like the Jungian view on, I would say, the shadow is that pretty much there are unexplored contents of your mind that in some sense have subconsciously generated, or you can say in moments of life where we are a conscious sense of self, and this conscious sense of self does not complete a moment of itself. In some sense, those incomplete moments can in some sense become subconscious directors of our movement, right? It's kind of like how Carl Jung says, unless you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, all right? Okay, more music that maybe matches the theme of this episode. We look at the dimension of self, we look at the dimension of the species, we look at the dimension of the perspective, the classification of the world. We look at the sense of self, and we pretty much realize what a self is pretty much a movement, right? Pretty much what life is it is an event, and based on the consciousness you have, this event has its specialized meaning, or it has in some sense a sort of no meaning needed, and life is just how it's happening. Right, when it comes to the outer realms, a person cannot, you see, the thing about the human creature is that because it is in the microcosm and it acknowledges the macrocosm, on some level the macrocosm is beyond its free will, so the individual has to accept it. Okay, that song went into outer space. All right, let's see. Anyways, I'm trying to say there's the view of the self, there's the view of the species, there's the view of the world. What life is movement, and it used to be unconscious movement, now it has become conscious movement. Human beings that are conscious of their movement can now wonder about why their movement is happening. In the effort to wonder about why the movement is happening based on your will, if you're a strong-willed person or you're a weak-willed person, you either, let's say, acknowledge the chaos first, then the order, or you acknowledge the order first and then the chaos. You know, most people's emotions, I would say, really arises from how their mind is holding the context of the world, or how their attention is accepted, in some sense, the meaning behind the space where the life is happening. You know, for the self, we can have, in some sense, an individual being, you know, corrupt, being cruel, being indecent. Being ignorant. And similarly, we can have a species, right? Imagine the species was just cruel, right? And so pretty much the moment, if the species was too cruel, it would probably go extinct. But like, I'm just saying that it's like we can fathom like what a species where all the members of civilization are cruel, what that would look like. We can fathom it in some sense in decency, you know. And what corruption is in some sense, this is where I would really get to the essence of this episode, which is that is corruption a compromise for incompetence? I feel that if there's an inner life and there's an outer life, the inner life has an expectation on the outer life. Our minds have access to worlds that our bodies don't have access, and so the human being is left to a position where it either has to listen to its mind and build, it has to trust its mind, or it distrusts its mind, right? If we started from not the sense of self part, and let's say there was a group of people who were corrupt, and these group of people who were corrupt, they somehow looked at this mirror, right? Or a person talked to them like a mirror, and then they suddenly wondered about, okay, why are we being corrupt? Or let's just even may take this to an extreme angle. Let's say on this planet there are the most evil person on this planet. Let's say in the shadows where nobody knows who this person is, but let's say there's an evil like the most evil people on the planet, okay? And it would be like this moment where the evil people would be like, why are we being evil though? You know? Right? They will wonder about how life has gone forth and come forth so far, right? And so they will reach a point where they will realize that at some point, this is my honest view, like this is, to me, I feel this is the explanation of corruption, right? on some point the person feels, if the person's mind is trying to sequence the value of the moment as if how many steps ahead can I be, right? If suddenly, it's like if you give paradise to someone too soon, it's as if they in some sense behave hellishly, right? This is like probably not a good way to say it, but like but what I'm trying to say is that when one wonders about why is there even a personality trait, through the Jungian view, the person is actually, the mind is not an individual, the mind is a space of awareness and all its content can be instantly viewed, right? So it's as if right now I'm here talking like da 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 da, but behind my mind there is a viewer. Imagine an unknown first sort of, let's say for the sake of speech, first person unknown viewer, right? And this unknown viewer, before I speak, it has a sort of, I would say mainly by emotion, a sort of, it's as if Carl Jung was saying all the personality traits are there in the mind of the person. That it's like before people are good and evil, it's their potentials are there in their mind. But when they act evil, good or evil, like good or evil, right? It's based on what out of the spectrum of personality traits behind their eyes, in some sense, they choose to own, right? You see, it's as if the human species should really, from the beginning of its birth, have an awareness of its mortality. But because we fear the unknown and we fear endings without meaning, right? Our species ignores. We ignore mortality, and so we solidify into this notion that we think we're an individual self forever. The way that actually the mind is behaving, it's under this premise, right? Who was it? I think it was someone, Sadhguru or someone, he was saying most people think other people die. Right? He was saying in some sense people are not conscious of their mortal position. Right? That means if we are, like, literally the reason we don't have an advanced civilization right now is because people are forgetting mortality and the sort of value system it brings, right? Where it's as if we are visitors to an unknown world where, since we were born and have a body, we can know it through a certain range of ability. So technically, before anybody manifests and does something which is good or evil or, corrupt or, honorable or whatever, right? It's as if there is an access to all the variations of selfhood. It's pretty much the mind, I feel, is fearless, but I feel the body is conditioned through fear. So it's as if really what imagination is like, when I say fearless, it's not something you can even consciously be like, my mind's fearless. No, it's just the nature of how it's happening. The body does, in some sense, there isn't a certainty for it to move, but when the mind can envision something successfully, then the confidence for the movement comes, right? So the mind has no fear, because our minds, deep down, there's an acknowledgement that it's not an object. So what I'm trying to say is, if people are minds, the mind is not treating itself as an object, it is treating the body as an object. And so it's kind of like this invisible subject is owning a visible object as a body, right? But the invisible subject is not personified, so the invisible subject has a complete fearlessness to perceive. To have a mind the way the human being does is to, like, as if you got a sort of free world simulator for Christmas or something. You know what I mean? The mind is another way for us to live before we live externally, for us to live internally to move internally before we move externally. The words that people hear, they are like, let's say, at the end of the movement of my mind. That means before I speak, it's like a sort of perception occurs, my attention moves through that perception, and then as it has moved experientially, then in some sense I know where the voice is going. So, if Carl Jung is saying the potential for the psyche to manifest in any other option is there, it's another way of saying that really before the child is conditioned into personality and before the world treats it in a certain way where the child identifies with a certain persona, the child is not a personality. That means children are not people until they notice themselves in the mirror, and then it starts, like the parents keep saying the child's name, and the child's like, oh yeah, I'm a subject and whatever. So technically, what the mind is attributeless potential for any attribute or the attribute that one has been exposed to. So think of it that there isn't just the alphabet for language, but let us consider that in some sense reality is a sort of language, and the alphabet of it is our memories. And so when the mind attempts to project and in some sense simulate itself or create a reality overlay upon reality, an abstract reality upon reality, like an overlay. It's pretty much, I'm trying to say that if there was no sense of ideological self, and if there was no culture or community or environment, it's as if it's attributeless potential. It's as if the person's like, who were you in your past life? And the person was like, I was potential energy of the cosmos to manifest, and then I reincarnated as a little boy, on Earth, It's like the cosmos reincarnated as a podcaster. That's some next level shit, But anyways, what I'm trying to say is that deep down there is an attributeless instantaneity of how attention and energy are being the experience of existence and the existence of experience. It's like it's a double-edged being, right? I think this is a great term to even create in psychology. I'm going to coin it, and hopefully my voice echoes on. Somebody takes this further, but in some sense, excuse me, the concept of double-edged beings. We are a double-edged life form. One edge is objective, the other edge appears subjective, but it is actually space. Really what the human being is in the terms human and being, like there is the psychology. There is the truth behind the psychology, a dimension of form, shape, and temporary manifestation of energy, the kinetic, energetic display. And then on another level, we stand as the potential of pretty much an infinite space to have finite manifestation. We're a potential. I'm pretty much saying like our life through space is an infinite potential. Our life through matter is a finite reality. The significance of Carl Jung talking about this, It's simply that we don't know who we are, especially if there's a potential to be anything. Now, I said at the beginning I would like to use myself as an example for this episode of when somebody notices like certain attributes within themselves, right? Let's say we have, let's say we have three people, let's say three kids, person A, kid A, kid B, kid C, okay? Now, imagine there's a fourth kid, kid D, and one kid starts hitting another kid in front of the other kids, right? So I'm saying it's as if one event takes place and there are others witnessing the event. Now, if the moment, in some sense, if harmony does not, it's like, I don't know how to say it. I want to say pretty much like the subconscious mind does not identify as a person. It's like it's not just a personality there. It's identifying as, it's like the brain can't tell it's a person or not when it sees an event, right? Or let me rephrase that. It's like I'm trying to say like a significant note about the nature of our subconscious mind. This idea of the subconscious mind is that the subconscious mind can't tell the difference, and it's pretty much how the language it hears or the event it sees is taken as it is, right? So it's as if, let's say somebody hit someone else, right, and the person saw the event but didn't hit, like wasn't involved in the event. Their brain can't tell if they were involved in the event or not. That means on the subconscious level, in behind the scenes of the mind, man, it's like reality is just, the senses are just being received as they are. But then through memories and whatnot, consciousness kind of stabilizes an identity. Pretty much when a human being gets out of a state of self-control, which is the definition of incompetence, a part of them wants to come back into control, and let's say the ego wants to come back into control quickly. So because it wants to come back into control quickly, it ignores the ethics of decision making, right? Recently, I'll share this, I was talking to someone I know very well, and there was a moment where that person was saying something to me which I should have let it go. Usually I act as if no one actually can see me. It's hilarious. There's the idea of wanting to create invisible cloaks, but like invisible suits. But in reality, how we see who we are being is one of the most private events of the realm. But anyways, there was an interaction, and in the interaction, instead of me letting go something, right, rather than instead of reducing the significance of the language I heard, my mind kind of went into the opposite, right? And I just took the language very seriously, and I suddenly noticed the moment I took the language seriously, it was easier for me to communicate in an indecent way, right? Usually when people witness, let's say you see a great warrior, right? Let's say you see, how would I say it? It's like there's a dark side, or there's a shadow to technically everything, right? Even the kindest people, the most, let's say, saintly, pure people. Like I'm telling you, the sun casts a shadow upon everyone. Pretty much, it's another way of saying the presence of reality presents karma to all those in the realm, right? And what karma is on some level recognizing how your attention, how the mind is in some sense starting it, and another way of seeing it is in some sense how the body can, in some sense, respond to it. You know, really the mind starts karma and the body ends it when the person physically is no longer here in this format. When I say karma, I mean the cause and effect relationships in the lifetime, not lifetimes, you know. If a person wanted to consider multiple lifetimes, that would be in some sense the bizarreness of a single lifetime becoming a memory. So let's say somebody has 10 memories, like it's easy for them to remember 10 moments of who they were in the past, right? So you can see each single memory being like a lifetime, right? So imagine you had a memory and you were considering it's one memory, but in that one memory there was like 100 years of memories kind of in within it, you know, kind of like a, you know, it's like there's data sets when it comes to karma, you know. So pretty much I noticed that when I believed or when I heard a communication that was different than my own reality, but a part of me accepted it, right? Then it was like an authorization. You see, it's like how we interpret, how we receive something really suggests how we're going to express our next moment, you know. Pretty much I heard a sentence, and instead of my mind being like, okay, that's, you know, somebody speaking, my mind went, no, that sentence is changing my reality, and so that's unacceptable. And then it became easy for me to have a sort of lack of consideration for how I spoke, right? I'm somebody, I'll tell you this, how would I say it, like, there's a saying that says, this scholar, I think his name was Abu Ali Sina, I'm not sure, but there was this scholar who was very polite, this very polite human being, and somebody went up to him and said, how did you become so polite, you know? And the you know, and the person said, I learned from the rude. Right? Now, if a person says, like, at least in my life, how it happened was that I actually, this is not easy to say, but I'll say it, I would say until 2011, due to this feeling of the world dishonoring my mind, or I refer to it as a karmic exile. That means it had nothing to do with people. Like right now as I'm speaking, I have a relationship with myself, I have a relationship with others in the species, and then I have a relationship with the world alone. That means there's ways that I am to myself when I am alone that no words can in some sense portray, right? But that's when I am alone with the that's when I'm in some sense in a conversation with the world rather than a conversation with the species, right? My own thoughts are pretty much, I would say, a sort of, some scholar had said, like, thinking is like, you know, the mind talking to itself, you know. And thoughts would be in some sense what a mind believes itself to be, you know. It's like the acceptance of the abstract as significantly as reality. Pretty much, I'll go over it again. Miscommunication. I took something seriously. The moment I took something seriously, my persona began getting involved. When my persona began getting involved, it was as if the ego wants to come back into control, or let's say a person's sense of self, they want to pilot smoothly as their sense of self. So when there's turbulence, like the pilot tries to quickly bring the plane out of turbulence, right? And so it was as if rather than hearing something and letting it pass by and internally not accepting it. It was as if I heard something, a part of me internally accepted it, and when I accepted it, I had to rechange the moment by, in some sense, speaking a bit indecently. Something I've realized is that this world, there has to come a effort to acknowledge multiple sectors of reality. When I talk about multidimensionality, people think, oh man, this guy's talking about spirituality or something, but in reality, it's like everything has been multidimensional from the beginning, and we are just awakening to it. Just the advancement of knowledge. When we look at reality, everything has dimensions, to the branches of a tree that connect to the trunk, or the fingers that connect to the palm, Pretty much, we say a person is the food they eat. I also believe a person is the information they receive, or how they interpret the information they receive, right? And when we get too convinced that our sense of self has to be a photograph rather than pretty much an awareness in a changing film, right? That's when I would say corruption, indecency, cruelty, like these things arise because a photograph doesn't want to change, That means, let's say the corrupt person and the cruel person and the indecent person, what they have in common is that there is an openness to accessing the result of a moment. It's as if like when you don't care about the consequences of something, we could say that is technically like a sort of cruelty, right? Like how would I say it? Like, I would say, in my view, I think I'm a very passive and, to some degree, kind person in the outer realms, right? But in my inner realms, for example, like I'm a cigarette smoker, and I interpret that as, in some sense, that no, that's not kindness, that's cruelty, right? That means a person can be cruel to themselves, indecent to themselves, and they can even be corrupt to their own self. That means ignoring their intuition, right? You see, so in the chat section, guys, my attention is coming to the comments. Honestly, I'll say, if you have been listening to these Mr.Within talks and you still think there is a good and bad person, like the mind has a potential for both, right? It's as if we have been spinning unconsciously in the wheel of duality, right? And now mankind has an ability to go beyond the wheel of duality, right? Even though the outer realms is dualistic, we can't. What I'm trying to say is that like our minds can give ourselves a freedom that one interpretation of an idea doesn't have to own it. See, the title of the episode is When the Sun Noticed Its Shadows. And at first, I thought of putting shadow, but I thought shadows, like the sun has multiple shadows, The sun is probably the only celestial object. It's the only object that has ridiculous amount of shadows, Whether the light hits an object or a light starts from an object, technically the shadow is attributed to the source of it, right? The sun cannot have a shadow when it is directly experiencing itself, but when the sun's light goes towards the edge of the cosmos, on some planet, some person who put a stick in the sand suddenly creates a sundial, What I'm trying to get to is that at some point, at the end of the day, the person's like, all right, who's making the decisions here? Who is making the decisions in regards to the implication of meaning? or in some sense, who is putting the meaning into the moment, or who is accepting the meaning into the moment, right? The nature of life is because it changes. That means new memories will in some sense override past memories. So a person can in some sense feel they're bad, but like they could do good things and suddenly feel they're good, right? Right. So imagine somebody does one bad thing and then they do 100 good things, right? Is that person still a bad person because they did one bad thing? You see, there's a multidimensionality to nature. Multidimensionality is another way of saying we cannot be convinced by the singular dimensions we're seeing, right? And emotions, guys. Emotions are, I think it's one of the most fascinating things that, like, you look at lesser animals, they have emotions, but they're not conscious of their emotions. We are the only species that has attempted to create a miniature world system. Let's say we are the only creature that is using symbols to pinpoint our internal reality, A person, sure, like I'm reading the chat section now, a person can feel, let's say you haven't done something in the outer realms. And so if your mind is result oriented, a person can instantly become good or evil. A person can be bad and, the person can feel worthless and suddenly having a lot of worth. Believe it or not, it's really how the acknowledgement of the moment happens. What I'm trying to say in this episode is that there is, imagine an exoteric and outer dimension, and there's an esoteric and inner dimension, and the esoteric is referring to the inner, right? The internal, the essence, right? And the exoteric refers to the surface, right? So in some sense, we are like an ocean, right? Or like a tip of an iceberg. We are like an iceberg where the tip of the iceberg is our domain of consciousness, where we are, in some sense, the mind builds for itself the moment's meaning, right? But then the tip of the iceberg has the rest of the iceberg that is in the unconscious. So even if a person says they are good, bad, corrupt, not corrupt, on some level, what we are is rooted in the unknown. Because its roots are in the unknown, the certainty of knowledge cannot become absolute, right? To me, I had this view on religion for some time. It was just maybe like a week or something where the idea was there, right? Where I was just thinking, is in some sense believing a holy book a sort of creating a partner for God? That means I thought about if the concept of God in, let's say, monotheistic religion is that it is something inconceivable, right? And so if a person wants to, let's say, worship the inconceivable, that means you're at least honoring it, and that means you're honoring how it is inconceivable. Now, in some religious texts, it says that the inconceivable creator of the universe has no partner, right? Like in the Islamic view, it says that. In Christianity, the archetype of Christ is very different than Islam, in the sense that Christ is God on earth in the Christian view, right? But what I'm trying to say pretty much is that God is inconceivable, okay? Now then the idea comes, if a person attributes the conceivable to God, right? In some sense, is that a sort of idol worship or idea of worship over the inconceivable truth, right? Who knows? Maybe there will come a day where instead of people, obsessing over, language, and its context from thousands of years ago, maybe in the future, religion becomes just like how we have, for example, let's say medicine, right? We have medicine, right? People get sick, they go to the pharmacy, get medicine. Let's in some sense have this view that we have certain books and ideological systems that can act as medicine, right? We have medicinal books, but not books written about medicine, you know what I'm saying? I think this is a genius idea. I mean, somebody go and do something with this, To me, what it is that the human psyche, on some level, people think like, I shouldn't think about power. Power is ego. I'm not an egotistical person. I should not think of power. But in reality, power is everything. But not power in the sense of a self-owning something. That's not possession. You see, there's a difference between a powerful being and a possessive being. Right? A possessive being is depending on its power based on, in some sense, absorbing something else. But a powerful being is its power instantly, Honestly, I could say Mr.Within school of thought, just pretty much I see there's an inconceivable dimension to life, there's an invisible dimension to life, and then there's a visible dimension to life. And the manifestation of our identity seems to be the interaction of invisible subjects with visible objects, or their interlinking instantly. The sun is technically shadowless when it's being itself. But let's say the sun identifies as a planet, right? And imagine we realize like black holes are like the shadows of like, celestial objects in another dimension or something. Somebody's suggesting, what if black holes are shadows? Somehow they're shadows. The body is known. The body is information oriented. Even food is technically information in a different form, right? The body is knowledge oriented, right? The purpose of consciousness as a manifest embodied being is pretty much to use the body that is present, right? It's as if imagine somebody opened their eyes and like they were imagine somebody opened their eyes instead of like just from this scene. Imagine you opened your eyes and you were in a mechanic shop and you had like a wrench in your hand, right? It's as if then you wondered what is the meaning of life, and imagine you had no other contrast, no other comparison to it. It would be as if it's to use what is there in your hand, right? So for me, like the purpose of human life is to use a 4.5 billion year old evolutionary potential, right? It's as if like the person's like, why did my ancestors survive, And violent people are like, my ancestors survived so I could punch people in the face, and and kind people, in some sense, they look at their ancestors and realize that they have carried a torch of great potential for the future. What it is that just like the Olympic torch being passed down, the potential of humanity is being passed down, and deep down, just through the rationality that we are individuals in a collective system, everybody has technically cared for the collective system. It's only when the collective system rejects the individual that the individual goes against the collective state. When I say collective state, I don't mean like, the community. I mean like a state of mind where one is I would say you don't even, it's pretty much like you are being collectively present as an existential event, and we are being individually present as an ideological event, right? Because the experiencer for a curious object has been pinpointed at least to a subject. Like, some person asked this enlightened guy, like, can you show me God? And the person's like, yeah, I can show you God. And the person's like, the person who had asked was like, whoa, you can really show me God? And the person's like, yeah, right? And the person tells them, close your eyes and for a second think about something, right? And I don't know, let's say the person thinks about what they did yesterday, right? And then pretty much the idea is that this enlightened person is saying what is moving your ego is the potential of the inconceivable momentum of being, right? So the idea is, in some sense, what is moving the object, the subject of the human being, what is moving the subject of the human being before the human being is a subject. And that is in some sense being attributed to a sort of, there's a life to this world that is hidden to the eyes that believe duality first. When Carl Jung said, in some sense, acknowledge your shadow as a major archetype, he is pretty much saying that the sun should be fearless in wondering its shadows. Why? Because it is the sun, right? Like human beings may be scared of the idea of ghosts or interdimensional beings or aliens or whatever, but you must be the sun. What that means is that everything else is the shadow, right? But when I say shadow, it means, what I mean by that is that what is the initial prime mover in the moment. Right now, as I'm giving this talk, it is the idea of me, but simultaneously it's how I'm being is my whole moment. And my whole moment is not limited to the idea of myself. It cannot be. Subjects and objects change. We cannot be them. We use them to manifest as a being, but we cannot be them. Right? The empty-handed position of the human being is it's like it's on another level. It's like in front of their eyes. Let's say if a person gets hurt, we say, okay, there's the pain being a sort of physical suffering, right? But let's say somebody feels, I don't know, let's say there's a sort of internal, if there's an emotional suffering, right? Pretty much. A subject can't die. I don't want to say it can't die, but I want to say pretty much like something that is not an object cannot break in the way that we see an object's breaking, meaning death, right? It's as if the mind is not, dare I say, a physical entity. It's entitled to a sort of physical position, but it is not a physical entity. And if it's not a physical entity, there comes this curiosity where the person's like, wait a minute, could my soul be how my ideas are sequenced before, in some sense, I sequence them through an archetype of a past self, right? It's pretty much when we trust the world, we happen alongside the world. When we distrust the world, we fight the world. When we fight the world, we break ourselves and the world, right? What I'm trying to say is that it could be that this whole thing about the dualism of morality, of corruption, justice, you know, indecency, decency, kindness, cruelty, like all these axi. Pretty much good and evil are the potential of something that is neither good or evil at the beginning. I ask myself, you know, what does my sense of self deserve? And then I ask myself, what does my species deserve? And then I ask myself, what does my world deserve? Or what does the world deserve, the species deserve, or what do I deserve? And I have realized that, I don't know, maybe this could be, you know, people may perceive it in 2022 as, you know, let's say, my mistake. But I feel that in the future, maybe its value would be different. But pretty much, I don't know why, but some part of my psyche realized that the victory of the species surpasses the victory of the individual in all possible ways. That means if 8 billion beings started to live for the whole system rather than living for their ethnocentric emotions and desires in their local part of the system, right? It's as if when we live for the species and then live for the world, or if we live for the world, for all the potential of the world, not just human archetypes, it would be in some sense as if we are living for our species and we're living for ourselves. It's pretty much wondering what is the victory of the individual, and it's a collective state, and what is the victory of a collectivity. Do you know? It is a worldly state. We are, the psychology 100%, the more technology gives us a permission to become interstellar, our psychology is going to start identifying with the celestial, with archetypes that you could say are more galactic. I think maybe give it 1,000 years, even though that's too much, maybe in a couple hundred years, but okay, let's say 1,000 years to be safe, right? 100% people are going to start naming their children about with celestial names, right? And I think we need a great team of philosophers to work with astronomers to see what other way we can, in some sense, interpret all of astrology, not astrology, astronomy so far. How are we naming the celestial objects? What do those names imply? And in some sense, where can it go? What I've noticed is that after nationalism, pretty much human beings were all speaking different dialects, right? And then inside a nation, and then when nationalism arose, when countries found when chunks of the parts of the earth began having an identity, which is another way of saying nationalism, then there came a sort of singularity of everybody learning the same language. And because everybody wants learn the same language, it's as if everybody wants to fit into a system where others have fit into it. So there's technically no one actually creating new languages, right? It's as if it's like the attention of the human being is going to more learning about past languages rather than creating new ones, right? I'm pretty much suggesting the urge to go and fit into the past is another way of saying you're denying your future possibility, right? And unfortunately, society is built that way. Society is built that way where when you believe in the past, you suddenly fit in, right? But if you believe in something that is a different variation of how the past is rendered the present, then in some sense you may have the notion that you are an outcast or something, right? But in reality, all of this is language, right? My intent really, or let me say it this way, in my inquiry into what is actually going on here for beings, I came into this realization of not just that there's all the dimension of the inconceivable, invisible, and visible, but I came to this realization that based on how the state of the mind is, the body listens, right? So it's as if how would I say it? Pretty much we need new archetypes if we want to experience a world we haven't experienced before. It's like what are the ways to enter a new world, right? Either your sense of self changes first, or your sense of the world changes, right? Either you physically go into a different place, or you change how your attitude to the same place was, right? Sorry guys, I'm sitting cross-legged and my legs are not let me see. Okay, quote tunnel. So I'm going to read quotes on corruption. G. Edward Griffin says to oppose corruption in government is the highest obligation of patriotism. I mean, honestly, the idea should be, it's like, could an honest civilization and a decent civilization, be way better than an indecent one? And believe it or not, right now we are experiencing like corruption, indecency, and cruelty in civilization. Like, not every human being has made the conscious leap into recognizing civility and even the laws that govern man's mind, not just cultural, social, I mean inner laws. It's as if like it was an advancement. To be civil means in some sense we have started to live more as minds than bodies. If you live more as a body, well, sure, violence will be a sort of maybe something refreshing. But when you realize 4.5 billion years has created such a sophisticated position for our minds to behave in ways that none of our ancestors could pretty much, It's like, what was that thing where Uncle Ben looks at Spider-Man and says, with great power comes great responsibility. It's like you look at, civilization, and you see with great evolutionary advancement, there comes, great civility. To be responsible for our evolutionary update and its potential, that is really when, the gas pedal is being pushed on an advanced civilization, or I should say, the person is, kicking, the street as they go forth on their hoverboard, The roars of the advanced civilization will come, It's as if, 8 billion sheep will realize they have been lions from the beginning. And in some sense, that is the great destiny of mankind, where the future generations lionize us because we attempted something that was beyond our historic condition. Just like when you look at the progression of history, physical movement has become more advanced, an ability to be let's say an invisible viewer of the content of your mind also. There's an advancement there. And the idea is that the person asks themselves, what does the world need? Right? I'm not saying that a person has to artificially not be corrupt and think they're, I'm saying that on some level we have to accept our natures but not allow culture to define it, and through our experiences wonder about what whisper is the world so poetically sending in our ear, right? What I mean by this is that every person's memory is like their conscious reception of their karma. And so pretty much a person can look at how they've lived so far, and it's pretty much like the world's feedback, And honestly, for this episode, I pretty much noticed that the potential of indecency, corruption, cruelty, anytime a person gets more convinced by their inner realms than the outer realms, right? Even though I do see potentials to the future, but it is the same sort of feeling that maybe a time traveler would have, and going from the future to the past, I would say someone from the present wondering about how the future should move. It's like there's a sort of similar, feeling of a dilemma, right? That the person in some sense looks at this life and says, okay, on some level it can just be. There is no ideological purpose. There's no need for human beings to organize in advance, and we should forget progress and try to be like the birds and the squirrels, that just allow the ecosystem to be their might, right? But from another view, it's as if why individual consciousness now? Why has the slumber of an unconscious object become, the conscious piloting of a subject? Why is there something moving here in a way where it can know how it's moving? That means it's like sometimes if a person has, let's say, a religious mentality, you may have this idea where you think like, man, was God cruel in like creating creatures that can notice their own suffering, right? Like one can say, I mean, that's not let's say that's a lesser view, but on some level the person's wondering about it, and then it's as if like this bizarre situation where before we were conscious as let's say an I thought, right? We didn't have any association to the pain and suffering that we were experiencing. That means how much of evolution passed by that regardless of memory, right, it was as if the creature had no opinion on how it's being a creature. So whatever pain and pleasure, they were both experiential events that had no attribute to any sort of ideological value, right? And it's as if like, man, 4.5 billion years we evolved just to notice we're suffering and temporary. It's like, man, I thought it's like, did we evolve to notice our suffering? But then we realized because we can notice our suffering, we can notice our joy. Because I went through an experience where I was indecent, now I like, for example, I have the capacity to recognize, okay, what would have the decent version of me have done in that situation, right? And so what I'm noticing more is that every person's mind and every person's inner realm is actually from the beginning of their birth in a sort of battle of what defines the will, right? So let's say some people who are younger where, I think this is really the difference between the kind of, for example, an example of it would be in wolves, like alpha, beta wolves and whatnot, gamma wolves, But it's just this notion that who has been fearless enough to be what they are before having to be something else, right? And most human beings, because I would say maybe the potential state of the mind is that it trusts the world to in some sense, be manifest in it. It's as if we start off with a sort of unconditional trust of how our mind is being our body, and then the battle begins when the person's mind has to consider not just the presence and position of other minds, but they have to consider the language in some sense ingrained in the cultures of the moment. That means, to me, believe it or not, we do say we have free will, but the free will is a little tiny moments of the day. Most of the day has a sort of structure. It's as if like, sure, we're not in the jungles, right? But we are still in the concrete jungle, which is another way of saying our environment is moving us or telling us how to move, right? And if a person doesn't discriminate between the environment, between their inner realm and outer realm, their outer realm can possess them. For some people who, let's say, you see, for example, with ideas of psychosis or mental illness, this is for those who cannot discriminate their inner realms as possessing their outer realms, right? All those people who have fragmented psyches, it's as if certain moments began defining all other moments. It's kind of like Lord of the Rings of, which incomplete memory tries to become complete, right? What I'm trying to say is that an ability to discriminate between what is your inner realm and outer realm and being able to be aware of both of them, I feel that is a state where, clarity and freedom are just authorized. If I think I'm a subject right now, the subject's gonna fear the destiny of an object. If I think about I'm an object right now, I'm gonna think about what did the subject do in the lifetime before I stopped being a subject. And I don't know, maybe I've reached a point maybe in, just diving into this stuff, where the value I see, it's as if, you first discriminate between objects, then you discriminate between, an object and a subject, then you discriminate between subjects, and then you discriminate to a point where you realize energy doesn't have to be anything. Right, so on some level a person can just be, but because the mind also has an antenna nature, it's what it is, it's kind of like Buddha says desire is the root of suffering, but without desire we cannot exist. So technically I don't know. I think maybe the idea is that the human species compared to other species can acknowledge the unknown. And so really the purpose of the human life is not to just be a harmonized, not to be a statue of just, it's as if I'm saying more than shape, an image or a shape or sort of photograph of truth being the meaning of this. In some sense, it is more like the species becoming content with the mysterious dimensions to life force. That contentment will allow the person to observe the spectrum of how they are considering meaning to be in phenomena. And the brilliant thing I would say about emotions is that an emotion is like an inner teleportation, right? That means a person can suddenly, be very tired, and then somebody says something, they get angry, and they're like, oh my God, where did all this energy come from? As if behind their eyes, they teleported into a different mode of, energy expressing as an individual. Okay, so I'm reading the comments in the chat section. Somebody writes something interesting. And by the way, guys, I've decided not to read the usernames. Yeah. Well, people can see it in the chat section. Somebody says consciousness frames unknowns with associated experiences and then builds conceptions of reality on top of those patterns without ever really experiencing the unknown at the center of it all. The thing is that the unknown technically cannot be experienced by consciousness because consciousness is shape-oriented. If the unknown is beyond shape, the only way you can experience it is if you realize you have been being it. That means it's like a person suddenly realizes, oh my God, I thought I was a good person, bad person, corrupt, indecent, evil, whatever, angelic person. But then I realized it's like I'm an unknown being this whole time. It's like, what have I been doing? Being. That was the live stream playback, guys. I guess this episode has to go to a finale. I don't know why I feel I need to. Hafiz has a great quote about the sun and the shadow. The sun shadow quote. Let me see. There's a quote by Hafiz where he says, I'm just going to go into a Hafiz quote tunnel. Hafiz is this Sufi mystic from, 700, 800 years ago. Hafiz says, even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, you owe me. Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky. Alright, I'm going to just read the quotes. Hafiz says, where is the door to God? In the sound of a barking dog, in the ring of a hammer, in a drop of rain, in the face of everyone I see. Hafiz says, all the false notions of myself that once caused fear or pain have turned to ash as I neared God. Hafiz says, run like hell, my dear, from anyone likely to put a sharp knife into the sacred, tender vision of your beautiful heart. I think, guys, Hafiz is saying, people should, write some honorable comments, in the chats. Hafiz says, any beloved who has just one color of hair, one gender, one race, the same suntan all the time, one rule book will only cause you grief. Oh, no, he's saying pretty much any beloved who has just one color of hair, one gender, one race, the same suntan all the time, one rule book will only cause you grief. That means life is multidimensional. If we think everything has to fit into our past perception, then we are, in some sense, it's like the person's not unlucky, they are just not allowing themselves. It's like somebody being unlucky, maybe we can say, is how the past unauthorizes the potential of the future, or the potential of behavior in the present. But really, on some level, language is language. If we give it too much emotions, then the meaning of the language or the attachment intensity of it is different. Hafiz says, Hafiz says the admission price to hear the lofty minstrels speak of love is affordable only to those who have not exhausted themselves dividing God all day and thus need rest. Hafiz says not many teachers in the world can give you as much enlightenment in 1 year as sitting all alone for 3 days in your closet would do. Hafiz says when no one is looking and I want to kiss God, I just lift my own hand to my mouth. Pretty much, guys, these mystic poets, they reached the state of mind where they were not people, they were like the whole moment, pretty much. Hafiz says the beloved, when he says beloved, he's talking about like truth or God. Hafiz says the beloved sometimes wants to do us a great favor, hold us upside down and shake all the nonsense out. Hafiz says, listen, this world is the lunatic sphere. Don't always agree it's real, even with my feet upon it and the postman knowing my door, my address is somewhere else. Hafiz says, I have learned so much from God that I can no longer call myself a Christian, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Buddhist, a Jew. Hafiz says, all the talents of God are within you. How could this be otherwise when your soul derived from his genes? So of course, guys, this guy's a poet, right? Keep on. Hafiz says every child has known God, not the God of names, not the God of don'ts, not the God who ever does anything weird, but the God who only knows 4 words and keeps repeating them, saying, come, dance with me. He's pretty much saying, like, live, truly live. Hafiz says, the heart is the 1,000-stringed instrument that can only be tuned with love. Hafiz says, we have not come into this exquisite world to hold ourselves hostage from love. Hafiz says you will find yourself knee-deep in ecstasy when all your talents to love have reached their heights. Hafiz says, we are people who need to love because love is the soul's life. Love is simply creation's greatest joy. Hafiz says, lovers don't tell all of their secrets. Hafiz says, I am full of love tonight. Come look into my eyes and let's go off sailing, my dear, on a long ocean ride. Hafiz says, what is the root of all these words? One thing, love. Okay, Hafiz. This man seems to be in love. Hafiz says, fear is the cheapest room in the house. I would like to see you living in better conditions. Hafiz says, grieve not, though the journey of life be bitter and the end unseen. There is no road which does not lead to an end. Hafiz says, the earth would die if the sun stopped kissing her. Wow. Hafiz says, if, like the prophet Noah, you have patience in the distress of the flood, calamity turns aside and the desire of 1,000 years comes forth. Hafiz says, don't surrender your loneliness so quickly. Let it cut more deep. Let it ferment and season you as few human or even divine ingredients can. Something missing in my heart tonight has made my eyes so soft, my voice so tender, my need of God absolutely clear. And God is, you got to consider, it's like the ultimate, right? The ultimate archetype at the time. Hafiz says, this is the kind of friend you are. Without making me realize my soul's anguished history, you slip into my house at night, and while I am sleeping, you silently carry off all my suffering and sordid past in your beautiful hands. Hafiz says, now that all your worry has proved such an unlucrative business, why not find a better job? Hafiz says, I wish I could show you when you are lonely or in the darkness the astonishing light of your own being. Hafiz says, you yourself are your own obstacle. Rise above yourself. This is it. This is one of the greatest quotes I've ever heard on my life. There is no idea that can become us. Life is a multidimensional living event, and language has attempted to contain it, but it never could. We are an unknown mover within the cosmos. There's freedom in the unknown, because then what is stopping anything, the potential of the unknown to become known? Do you know? Unknown moments could be as beautiful as known ones, you know? Hafiz says, wherever God lays his glance, life starts clapping. You see, guys, this guy from 700 years ago. He is pretty much trying to move the mind from its cultural, ideological grasp into a state where the person can allow themselves enough freedom to notice that freedom is not conditional to shape. We are free beyond shape, technically, like all these ancients seem to be saying that. And what do we suffer from? The shape of how the moment happens. The shape of the moment. Hafiz says, just sit there right now, don't do a thing, just rest. Hafiz says, the heart is like that, blessed and ruined once it has known divine beauty. Wow. Hafiz says, I sing to the nightingale's hearts, hoping they will learn my verse. Hafiz says, the sun's eyes are painting fields again. Hafiz says, and for every reason in existence, I begin to eternally laugh and love. Hafiz says, the sun won a beauty contest and became a jewel set upon God's right hand. Hafiz says, I wish I could speak like music. Hafiz says, laugh because that is the purest sound. Hafiz says, the sky is a suspended blue ocean. The stars are the fish that swim. Wow. Wow. Hafiz says, God blooms from the shoulder of the elephant who becomes courteous to the ant. Hafiz says, the sun's lashes with expert strokes are sweeping across the land. Hafiz says, for your separation from God, from love, is the hardest work in this world. And let me see, what else is there? Okay, there's a quote about corruption. No, that's something else. There's this quote irrelevant to Hafiz. It's from Ayn Rand from this website. She says, when you see corruption being rewarded and honesty becoming a self-sacrifice, you may know that your society is doomed. Theodore Roosevelt says, no man who is corrupt, no man who condones corruption in others can possibly do his duty by the community. Kurt Cobain says, the duty of youth is to challenge corruption. George Richard Marek says, corruption is simply crime without conscience. Yeah, when you stop caring for the outer realms, you become a monster. You can become a monster. Who was it? There's two different ways of seeing this. Aristotle had this quote, let me find it. Aristotle says, he who is unable to live in society or who has no need because he's sufficient for himself must be either a beast or a god. Right? That means your mind is either savagely conditional or your mind is unconditionally civilized. That means your nature is not dependent on the result of a world of an objective setting where the mind is beyond that objective setting. Our minds are how we are being the space for our movement. Anyways, the idea here, dear listeners, is that observe your shadow like the sun that noticed its shadows. And after you acknowledge the shadows and you wonder about where the chaos comes from, you will discover, in some sense, an unconditional order. It's pretty much like conditional order, let's say conditional chaos, conditional order, unconditional chaos, and then conditional order. Anyways, thanks for listening, and maybe this might be an interesting announcement. I'm not so sure of it, but I've been considering it, that I think at the end of the 2000th episode, I got a bunch of episodes to also upload, but after the 2000th episode, I think is I need to log out of this YouTube account and to, in some sense, experience something, I would say, beyond the effort of my own inner realms. It's fascinating in this life, the species, I feel one of the biggest challenges is the balance of where the meaning of reality comes from. Should it come from more of a mental being, which has an infinite potential to visualize any subject as itself, or is it coming from a physical being that has to work with, let's say, limited objective, a physical potential, It's like if our minds stray away too far from the idea of like the role of the human being, it's as if it's very easy to say that inner extinction is when the mind forgets its humanity. And so I feel really the greatest argument is that the smartest thing that 8 billion creatures can do on a rock is to discover what the most advanced possibility of the most efficient possibility of reality. That means it's like no longer the species should hold back in visualizing that which is not 1 step ahead, 2 steps ahead, 3 steps ahead, but that which is as far as your mind, in some sense, can throw a spear into the sky of the unknown. Anyways, thanks for listening. Much blessings and namaste. And if a person is incapable of being kind to themselves, to being honorable, just to themselves, and being decent to their self, they will not find that ability to show it in others, like for the species in the world. right? You know, the human being has to find an inner honor that allows itself to forgive inefficiency and in some sense build and design and, march efficiently. Anyways, much blessings and honestly, thank you for listening.